The Norwegian Method.
I'm Olav Alexander Boo, peak human performance developer, coach to Christian Blumenfeld and Gustav Iden.
I'm Dr. David Lippman, a health and human performance specialist, and welcome to the Norwegian Method Podcast.
The Norwegian Method.
Welcome to the Norwegian Method Podcast, and thanks to Morten, Leaders in Endurance Fueling, for sponsoring today's episode. Check the show notes for links and details of a one-time 20% off code to use at morten.com on orders of the 1/52 collection, a one-week training pack. Welcome back to the second episode of the Norwegian Method Podcast. I'm joined here again by Olav. Thanks for joining me again. And today we're going to talk about planning. The remit here was for us to talk to age group athletes, and one of the things you gave as feedback to me before was actually how many of these age group athletes are spending significant amounts of time planning, talking about multi-year approaches, all this sort of stuff. And I said, listen, hopefully it trickles down. Hopefully they're starting. And if they aren't, hopefully this helps. And let's get into it. So I guess let's start with probably more so pre-planning is testing. I know that your off-season always starts with testing, right? And we've seen the videos. So what would you suggest is an optimal amount of testing? And then what do you think is a minimum? So let's give the two bounds within there. So maximum and minimum amount of testing. And let's call testing a metabolic profile. So labs, let's call it VO2 max, etc. And then once we have that baseline, how do we then go from there? And we can go what you do with Christian and Gustav, or we can go sort of a step back as well, or perhaps we do both.
Sounds good. I think I'll actually let you lead the way here because this one is I think the problem a little bit when it comes to planning and so on, this is more, let's say, a way when you have reverse engineered.
Yep.
And you're looking at, okay, what you have done the testing. So you have identified a gap. How do you bridge that gap?
Yep.
And here, of course, there is a lot of different theories for how you should periodicize your training and so on. I think that at the moment you have defined your approach the same way we do, that you do exactly, okay, what is the target? What are the goals? What are competitions that we are going to work towards? And then you have identified the gap by doing testing and define, okay, you like looking at the performance model. So metabolic profiling is obviously one part of it, but you do also mechanical power profiling or velocity profiling of the athlete. And then when that is being done, it comes down to how do you distribute your budget?
Yep.
And that is, of course, normally done through periodization. And then, of course, you have a lot of different kinds of periodization models. Some do like traditional periodization, some do reversed periodization. Of course, it would depend probably a little bit on what kind of sport you're doing. So, of course, for most Olympic sports where the duration of the events are shorter than 1 hour and some extending up towards 2 hours, and cycling maybe being the one sport, let's say endurance sport, combined with sailing that has the longest effective competition time, I would say. Then people are starting to talk a little bit more about maybe you do like reverse extrapolation. So you do like more like the high intensity stuff early in the season to create a fundament for what's to come. And then as you progress throughout the season, then you start to do more the specific or let's say longer duration work. But then of course you have those people that just do traditional periodization where they just go by base work early in the season or what they call like resource work. And then they start to build in a build period where they're starting to increase a little bit the intensity, and then you come into the specialization phase before you go to taper. Mm-hmm. But I would say all models are correct and all models are wrong.
All models are wrong, some models are useful.
Exactly. Yeah.
100%. Okay, so then maybe let's think about it a different way. If I'm an age grouper approaching you and I say, listen, I'm competing in the World Championships. This will be in October, and it's now November of the previous year. So I've got effectively a year. How do you approach the situation there? How would you approach that? Saying I've got 20 hours a week of training and I've got 50 weeks to go from there. So what would that look like from you? Where would you want full-scale testing? Where would you want to have check-ins and those sort of things?
So again, first I would understand what is my current status. Of course, you already defined the goal, and that's Kona next year, and you probably also have a target that you're going to read, that you are aiming for. So maybe you are looking to climb the ranks, or you're maybe even aiming for the podium. And if you are aiming for the podium, then of course, then you can look at history a little bit, and you know the range of where people are, depending on the weather and so on. Some years they are going a little bit faster, some years a little bit slower, very much dependent on weather, of course. But you have a fairly good idea of what is the target. So you already told me one very important thing, and that is basically what is your goal. You're an age grouper, and you're going for the World Championship in Kona. My first question would be, do you have experience with racing in Kona from before?
Yeah. So let's say that I've raced and I want to go faster by, let's call it pretty conservative. So let's say I went 11 hours, I want to go 10:30. So.
And so you've been in Kona and you
Yes.
raced 11 hours. Okay, that's super, because then Ironman courses are very different. So like, let's say a time target that works in one course doesn't necessarily work in another course. So you already said that you want to improve your time by 30 minutes. And what I would do then is that, of course, for most people, they don't have access to a laboratory where they can do testing, and even less where they can do the testing they want to do. You are more or less forced to do a certain kind of protocol that lab adheres to or believes in. So I would say that probably will have a very limited value to your, let's say, to your understanding of your performance.
Well, let's double click on that for a second. So I can go down the road and get my VO2 max done. They'll give me thresholds with it, and they'll give me paces for that. And let's say they're good enough that they'll do that for bike and run. So now I can get a velocity at VO2 max. I can get velocities at different lactates with heart rates for both running and cycling. So now you have that, and you have wattages of course as well. So now you've got a bit of a profile. Let's talk about that and why that might not be as helpful as perhaps some other testing you might do.
So first of all, it depends on, it's not a long time ago since our power meters had an accuracy of plus minus 5%. Mm-hmm. And then they came down to plus minus 2%, and that's even less time ago. Now we are in general down to, let's say, plus minus 1%. But we also have to understand that that's not always true. If you take even like one brand, one model, and you basically take 5 of that one, you'll find probably bigger variations between them than 1%. One specific one that you are having will probably for a while stay within that 1%, but most likely over time it will start to drift because there are bearings and other things that are getting a little bit worn, many things that are happening to it. But in general, I would say power meters are very accurate and reliable. I don't spend very much time on questioning whether the power meter or the power for a day for Christian was correct or not. Further, the problem with metabolic cards is that they have, unfortunately, an accuracy which is even less. That's not the only problem. That's further enhanced by that respiratory dynamics are highly dynamic, so that it fluctuates quite a lot, because your breath is not going to be constantly. So even if you're, let's say that you're looking at 60 breaths per minute, you're not going to breathe one time every second. Yes, in average you do that, but that's not the case. It's the same with heart rate. That's why we measure, for example, heart rate variability. Yep. And there's also call it a breath frequency variability. And that means also that even if your volume of air is reported to, for example, 200 liters per minute, or let's say your tidal volume, or to make it simple for myself, let's say your breathing frequency is 50 and your tidal volume is 4 liters per breath. That means basically now you're ventilating 200 liters per minute, or exhaling 200 liters per minute. The problem is that your tidal volume is not either going to be 4 liters per breath. It also changes. And the body is, of course, very sensitive, very, very sensitive to what's going on inside it. Like, for example, what is the levels of carbon dioxide? And then the levels of carbon dioxide is, of course, a result of your oxygen levels in your body. So, for example, let's say that you are running and you are breathing a little bit less for very short time. That will automatically drive a higher extraction of oxygen for the same amount of air now. But at the moment, basically, you start to compensate, you start breathing more, then it starts to reduce the fraction of, or let's say of oxygen that it extracts from the air. And this is not like on a bike where you basically, if you like put in more force, you just get more power for the same cadence, or you will just start to accelerate. This is not how the body is working. because this is more on call it the supply side. So you can say the demand is basically the velocity or the power. So you create a demand. You say, okay, this is the power I'm going to do now. And then it takes a little bit of time for the body to respond to this. One of the things that also this is, like if you were going to do a test on a bike, or you're going to do a test out running on the field, you would never do like 1 minute ramps, 1 minute ramp, 1 minute ramp, 1 minute ramp, basically to exhaustion, to understand basically your velocity profile or power profile or anything like this. This is a little bit of like an artificial setting in order to, like, say, create a robust protocol in order to determine in a standardized way VO2 max across athletes. We know there are different methods that you can employ that will easily drive up or create a higher VO2 max than just doing a ramp graded exercise test. But that's not the point. The point is that you are locked into doing a certain protocol in a lab, which is fairly out of context for what really you are training for or what you are looking to improve. And secondly, also your threshold. Then we can ask, what is threshold?
We won't go there yet.
No, there are so many definitions of it that it is crazy that we don't have a universal language for it. There are of course some models which are more like scientifically you can, or like say reproducibility of the models are much micro, like maximum like the steady state and so on. But other than that, then there is getting quite fuzzy. Having access to a metabolic or cart or laboratory to do testing is something that you don't have. And again, it has maybe a limited value. More important, I would say, then to do the testing in order to understand the gap would be to do let's say, at least for the bike, do a power profile. Yep. But it's also quite useful then to do that in a place where you can also look at the ratio between, let's say, power and velocity.
Yep.
So here, the reason why it's important to go out and test on a stretch, or on a controlled place, basically, let's say you go somewhere which is very, you know, the environment is fairly controllable. That means that now you can even look at using like methods like virtual elevation, and you can even look at your CDA. So you can look at the power to speed ratio, or
Yep.
And that gives you one more detail as well. One, you can get your power profile, you have your velocity profile, and now you can also look at everything from biomechanics to work economy, aerodynamics, and these kind of things. Running, I would say that's exactly the same. Today we have power meters in running, which is extremely repeatable. That means you can also go out and you can do a power profile also on the run, and there you then get a velocity profile or a speed profile, and you get power profile.
Yep.
And in this sense, you can also start to look exactly on there also what's going on there. Are you producing a lot of power for the same velocity as other people are doing, or are you equally good there? Is it more like a limitation in your profile than necessarily in the optimization between the two in the work economy? So this is probably the two single most important measures that you can do in order to understand a little bit where to optimize your performance. The optimization that happens on the biochemical side is much more advanced, and I would say there are not probably that many people that actually know how to integrate it, because it's very often a field where coaches are not normally working. Coaches normally work with power and they work with speed or velocity, while very often you find more the physiologists are working in the laboratories or doing the metabolic profiling.
Yep.
But the problem is that they don't work with power. So there's a disconnect actually between the metabolic measurements and the power measurements, but there is actually very little disconnect between the power and velocity, because that's the tool of the coach and the athlete.
Yep.
So that was a long detour. So bringing it back exactly into the question, what to do now? It's in November. You're going to improve your...
Well, we'll come to that in 1 second. I think just to further explain a little bit better for people, I guess, is the VO2 max or lactate tests you'll do in a lab are generally, as you say, the goal is to achieve end game. So VO2 max velocity, maximal effort at usually within 10-15 minutes, right? So if I'm correct, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would be profiling that slightly differently, which is knowing roughly where you're going to end up. So you know that, your athlete, whoever that is going to have a roughly this velocity, and therefore you use a longer step to have the same rough duration, and you probably have a good idea of duration that should be reasonable before you start to see durability issues. So you say, okay, we don't want to go for more than 40 minutes. Maybe it's 30, maybe it's 20, because we know that there's fatigue that's going to play in, and we know that you're going to be roughly in this spot. And that's really what you care about, is that, yes, maybe the top, but also perhaps around threshold. So you probably start a bit below there, use a longer stage so that you hit steady state and you have a better understanding of where things are at, or relatively metabolic steady state compared to, say, a 1 minute interval where things are so volatile. So you use, say, a 5 minute block and you go across this, and you use a much more precise way of going, listen, we're going to end up here. We're going back a couple of steps, and it's a lot more, the increments are smaller as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's one, but I would also say that I would create a protocol in order also to let's say, disclose or to identify what is important for that specific athlete and modality as well. So, for example, I would use a different protocol in the laboratory for, let's say, for a short course athlete versus a long course athlete, and also depending on modality, I would also use different protocols. I wouldn't go with one standard protocol. I would create a protocol which is bespoke in order to exactly get us detailed picture of that athlete's profile, because again, that is much more interesting for me than creating like statistical data, because I'm looking to let's say, to drive peak human performance, and that is something that you have to do. It's a research project into each individual, more or less. You can't go by, okay, this worked for my grandfather and this worked for my father, so it should work for me as well.
And you're really focused on in there is hitting the right velocities at those critical junctures. Call it a threshold that you're crossing, call it the VO2 max that you're hitting. You really are interested in that velocity, because that is almost more helpful in some regards, because then you can prescribe based on that velocity as well, knowing roughly where you're at. So you're starting to see the link in the model between velocity and the metabolism, which is, I guess, what I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, and how this actually plays out in the field is that in the lab, of course, what we get there is that we get, of course, output numbers, and we get like input numbers, or input and output numbers. They are unfortunately disconnected when you come out into the field. They are not the same. So, for example, if you go into a laboratory, of course, some they are closer, some they are further away, and that is purely a function of actually even how much time you have been using on a treadmill or on a turbo or whatever. And if you're not used to that, there will probably be a bigger gap between your power on the road and the power on the turbo, for example, or on and so on. And that means also that you can't necessarily just take and just say, hey, we found your power, or let's say your threshold on the lactate profile to be, or even your FTP for that sake, if you test it on a turbo inside. You can't take the number and just
it's not
use it out in the field. It's not going to be the same, exactly. And that means also that what I look for more in the lab are, of course, exactly to get like very deep understanding of the profile of the athletes and the biochemical and biomechanical efficiency. And then I would say that when we move out into the field, of course, then I have some numbers that I can work on, and I would for the intensity control. This is where I would then know that, okay, this guy sits around, let's say, for example, using lactate. So I would know that, okay, for Christian, he sits in around, let's say, some times of the year, depending on where we are, and these kind of things, let's say he sits around, let's just use a number, 2.5 millimoles. Then we go out and we know, in the laboratory, we found that to be 2.5 millimole would be, let's say that sits around 350, 60 watts, whatever. And then when we go out, we would say, okay, we know that he is, let's say, not riding as well on the turbo as he does outdoors, just because of the sheer amount of hours that he's training outdoors compared to indoors. And then when he is training now outdoors, we will maybe, okay, let's target 360, and then we just see what the lactate is there on the first interval. And then maybe he comes in at now, let's say 2.1 millimole or something, just like making up some numbers here, and then we say, okay, that's good. Just how do you feel? And he said, I feel like I'm not at the same RPE that I felt in the lab at the same number. So I can probably go harder and still not be at 2.5. So okay, how much? 20 watts. Okay, fine. And it goes off again. This whole thing takes less than a minute.
And I think that's really important to underline again, is the RPE is a really big part of that. Is that people need to be dialing this. I've spoken to the guys about this, and they say, we use all the tech so that we don't need to use it, which the whole thought is, let's get our internal computer and our internal technology better able to understand our physiology and where I can go and where I can't go. So the whole goal is to use the technology to be able to not use it, right? It's not to be reliant on it and be fragile as a result. It's to be robust against, having all this feedback so that your internal feedback is better. So he's then saying, and the other thing to double click on from what we talked about earlier in the podcast in the first episode is the self-efficacy you're building in Christian there, which is, what do you think? Oh, you're 20 watts. Okay, cool. Let's go with 20 watts and see how it is. And empowering him to make that decision based on that is so crucial as well.
Yeah.
So where we're at is, we talked a bit about why we wouldn't test necessarily in the lab, in a traditional lab, how that test may vary if we're doing it in the field. We've got velocity profiles, we've got speed profiles that are probably better than metabolic profiles necessarily for the most part of people. So now we have an age grouper who's trying to go from 11 hours to 10:30, and we have some idea of velocity and power profiles.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess, how would you build a season for them? What does that look like? I guess we have obviously a gap analysis. We now know where we need to go. We need to go there. Is it a linear thing, or do we put a period of training in place and then retest? How does that look there?
I would say that to avoid any false positive or false negatives, stick to the velocity profile and power profile.
Because bad data is worse than no data.
Yes, yeah.
Yep.
I would say so, yeah.
Yes.
So when you now have this speed profile or velocity profile or and power profile, then I would basically look at, okay, where do we want to be and where are we currently? And also because you probably already are fairly fast triathlete if you've done 11:30 already.
Yep.
Then, and you're looking to bring it down to 11 hours.
Yeah, we go 11:30 to 11, or we can go 11 to 10:30. Whatever.
10.
Doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Same.
Then, of course, you probably have a quite long training history as well. So you can compare a little bit like, okay, what is your profile now? Maybe you've done a profile before. If you have done that, that's brilliant. If you don't have, then of course you still probably have done quite a lot of efforts that are, let's say, close to exhaustion or quite good. So you can start to compare that a little bit with what it looks like now. Let's say now you have a profile where, and this is of course where we start to come into a domain where people ask, but what is a good ratio? What's a bad ratio between when you have a profile? What should it be between 5 minutes and 10 minutes and 10 minutes and 20 minutes, for example? I think we will have to come back to that a little bit later, more like with practical cases. But normally, let's say you find another guy that you are training with, for example, then you can at least start to compare a little bit between the two of you.
Yep.
And when you're comparing between the two of you, you can maybe say, we know that you are strong in endurance and this is your profile. Oh, that's quite interesting. Maybe this is good. And you're also looking to get better. So maybe both of you actually are looking to actually make your profile flatter. So we're going to distinguish between, let's say, a more horizontal or flatter profile and a more vertical profile.
Vertical profile refers to being faster and then having less endurance, or the other way around?
So basically a flatter profile, more endurance, more vertical profile. So horizontal profile, more endurance profile, and a vertical profile, a more like short duration athlete. So you're doing an Ironman, so obviously you really don't need that kind of high-end power or like top speed or whatever. You are really looking to have something that allows you to run fast for a long time, cycle fast for a long time, swim fast for a long time, and without basically tapping too much into, let's say, your carbohydrate stores, because you have to spend them wisely over the day. In order to go the fastest possible. So then the way I would periodicize it is that, for example, if I see, let's say that for most triathletes, I would say that they probably have a fairly flat profile.
Either through genetics or through training, right? They've either arrived there, they've either had that all their life, and that's why they ended up in triathlon, or some propensity towards that, or they've ended up there through training. Either way.
And I would say that maybe not so much because of genetics. I would say more just, and you could maybe say that genetics is a part of the reason, but I would say more a little bit what you actually just prefer doing in your training, because basically your profile is heavily influenced with what you do in your training. And let's say that you really like those long rides where you're pushing like semi-hard or something like this, that's going to have a huge impact on your profile. Just touching quickly back on this maximum like the steady state and the time to exhaustion. for anything to have like an impact on your profile, the reason why maximum lactate steady state or metabolic steady state is a very effective point is because we have a limited amount of energy and time available to do something with our profile. And the higher intensity you go, the shorter the time to exhaustion is going to be. At the moment, let's say that duration that you're targeting is long enough that you really are stressing dominantly your aerobic system. That is also then going to influence mostly also your aerobic system too. Of course, the higher you go, the more of an impact it will also have on your anaerobic system too. But basically, the body will always try to fix, let's say, your problem or basically the demand that you are trying to solve the most sustainable way, easiest and most sustainable way. That means that for longer duration, obviously, the body will not, if you do like long rides and you do them also like semi-hard, you can't really have a very powerful anaerobic system as a function of that. So you will typically train down your anaerobic system if you like do a lot of that kind of training, especially close to exhaustion. But in order to have any improvement, basically what we are looking to do is to make a dent in your power profile or velocity profile. So let's say that what I mean by a dent is basically if you now plot, for example, a line between your short, medium, and long duration power. So let's say that we, for the sake of simplicity, we use 5-minute power, 20-minute power, and 60-minute power, and you do those kind of efforts, then basically for you to influence your profile, you are looking to make a dent in that one. So basically you're either pushing up your 60-minute power or you're able to ride that 60-minute power, the same powers you did for 60 minutes yesterday, you're looking to ride now that longer tomorrow. I wouldn't probably advise doing that, but anyway. And the same thing actually, if you're trying to do something in the more or less in the short duration domain, then even not 5, I would say even 5 minutes is a long duration. But let's say you wanted to bring up your anaerobic power, you are looking basically to increase, that's to see exactly that your power actually now increases in the really short domain. And what I can say immediately is that if you do this repeatedly and you do this in a correct periodized way, you will also basically see that your lactate let's say that your lactate accumulation rate actually goes up as well. I'm hesitant to call it lactate. Well, you can call it lactate production as well. Lactate production, but you will basically see that your lactate production comes up for the same amount of time. So when you do a maximal effort, then you know that also your anaerobic system is getting more powerful. But basically, let's say for your really short duration power to come up, basically normally your anaerobic, or let's say the glycolytic power or anaerobic power, including the rest of the anaerobic systems, have also to become more powerful as well. There is a fairly good correlation between these guys. If there is not a correlation in these two, then it is purely because there is starts to become a decoupling between efficiency, or let's say the metabolic or let's say anaerobic part of it and the power output of it, which is not good. Or maybe it is good because your efficiency is increasing, but that depends on which direction it goes. So without further ado, back to the profile. So basically then, if you are riding a lot, you have a very flat profile. You can imagine that if you now just do traditional periodization and you are time constrained, then to make a little bit like of an anecdote or to simplify it a little bit, your 60-minute power cannot be higher than your 30-minute power. Yeah. Your 30-minute power can't be higher than, let's say, your 5-minute power. And that's impossible. If you do all-out efforts, true all-out efforts, and you are the state you go into them are the same. And even then, even if you're not equally rested going to them, even then still your 5-minute power should be significantly higher than your 60-minute power. But if the drop, or let's say the ratio between these becomes too low, so let's say your 60-minute power is very close to your 30-minute power, like doing rides trying to improve your 60-minute power will be very difficult. So what you have to do is you have to start with a shorter duration and start to raise that shorter duration power first, so that you create some room for your longer duration power to increase. The difficulty with this is very often that when you first increase your shorter duration power is that you might reduce your longer duration power. And then when you try to switch back, you are just back to square one. And this is, of course, a little bit where you need to put in just enough of a maintenance work when you first developed that, let's say, shorter duration power, so that you don't lose that when you're now trying to bridge back your, let's say, longer duration power. And the same way also when you're trying to lift your shorter duration power, you're trying to do just enough work that you are maintaining your longer duration power. And that would dictate a little bit how I would then, let's say do my season. But what we also have to be aware of is that, of course, doing more like high intensity work means also that people very often are more prone to get sick, injured, and other things as well. So I would always, if I had a longer off season, I would always start doing anyway some, call it like base work or whatever like this, just to get the movement patterns back in. And then gradually start to bring in more into that intensity as the weeks passes by and you're getting more ready for that, even though you are far away from your competition. And then start to look at, okay, how long time would it likely take to change these characteristics, and how much time do I need in order to start to harvest on what I basically then develop in order to maximize that on race day.
We are brought to you today by Plasmade. Plasmade is a proprietary liquid performance and recovery supplement formulated using only one active ingredient, French maritime pine bark extract, aka PBE. PBE is an adaptogen which triggers your body to produce a stabilized form of nitric oxide, which is a powerful vasodilator, improving blood flow to muscles and the brain. Plasmade is for use pre and post exercise, augmenting other energy and hydration supplementation used. In addition to all of this, Plasmade also has powerful anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, which aid in recovery from training and competition. For your 25% discount on Plasmade and to learn more, head to the show notes.
Yeah, I think I'll touch on a couple of things there. There's a concept we used to talk about a lot in strength and conditioning called anatomical adaptation, and it's the equivalent of base phase for endurance athletes. And I think that's really important. It's a really cool way to think about it. Is the tissues aren't ready, and the tissues are what's going to break down, especially in an age group athlete, especially in somebody who's trying to do triathlon. Like the most common injuries are overuse injuries. You need to reintroduce things very slowly and then be able to bring intensity later. So at the moment we've got a power profile. We're off season. We've done a bit of base building. Now we're sort of, all right, we've got, let's call it 11 months to Kona. And we've got a bit of an idea of how we want to go about it. You know, I'm a flat profile, therefore I'm going to start by raising the ceiling, a little bit. So if we use a house analogy, my floor is too close to my ceiling. I need to raise my ceiling a little bit before I raise my floor again. So now, okay, I have this trajectory. How often am I testing? Or is it actually, you don't need a test. You can use training data in a much better way or as a way to not have to taper down as we talk.
So I think that, again, now we just said that, okay, lab is something that's going to be unavailable to most athletes,
or not quite as helpful as we'd love to believe.
Yeah. So that means that you are then limited, of course, to your power meter and your GPS. And there are two ways to go about this. One is where you have like a standardized set in cycling or running, or actually you need a couple of standardized sessions in cycling, and you need a couple of standardized sessions in running, and the same for swimming.
So those would be indicator sessions. So we say we do, call it whatever you want workout, and we do this every now and again, and we look at the metabolic profile of that. So A, is the velocity changing? Or if the velocity is constant, is our heart rate decreasing? Are our internal measures decreasing as well?
Well, actually not metabolic profile, because we're not doing metabolic profiling. We're only doing power profiling or velocity profiling.
Okay, sorry. So indicators of intensity, I guess, are they changing? So is lactate changing, or is heart rate changing, or is something like that changing for the same output, or is the output improving?
Yeah. Yes. So if you have access to a lactate meter, that is quite a very practical tool.
Yeah.
Because if you, of course, we have talked about, of course, all the caveats
or
pitfalls with a lactate meter,
and many of them exist for heart rate as well.
Yeah,
for the record.
Yeah, but less. The benefit, of course, if you do a lot of lactate measurements, is of course that you add robustness to the measurements, because at some point you're going to get several measurements that are probably going to be around where they are actually, and you get some outliers. And if you now see that, of course, your power starts to increase for the same lactic concentration, that is in general a good indicator. Of course, again, we can complicate this by saying, maybe there is you are more hydrated, or the higher plasma concentration or plasma volume, not concentration but volume. But let's, for the sake of simply, keep it simple. Then generally an increase in power duration for the same lactic concentration is a good indicator of that the aerobic system is getting more powerful. So your sustainable power output is getting better, and vice versa. If it goes the other direction, then most probably your anaerobic system is getting more powerful, or your fitness is just deteriorating.
Yeah.
But
so for these indicator sessions, people are looking to improve work done in a given time frame. So half-hour power is increasing, so more work in the same time, or more distance covered, or something like that.
Yes.
As simple as that, stopwatch, distance be done.
And I would even say that these are actually brilliant power. You can also use power profiling or velocity profiling sessions as well, where you go out and you have a session, and then in this session, so instead of having like today, let's say you do you're gonna have a high intensity workout or whatever. So let's say you have a high intensity workout today, and now instead of going out and you do a couple of like certain intervals, you do like progressive intervals, and you do them quite like more like ramped, so that you start off like more easy on them, and then basically you build towards like a 5-minute all out at the end of that one. That gives you a very good idea exactly of, okay, what have happened to my 5-minute power now?
Yeah.
Have it improved? Is it stable, or is it have it gone down a little bit? And this is what is important. This is important to do not only for that single one. You have to do it for at least 2 power outputs. I would say maybe three different ones. So one short, like 5 minutes, or it can even be 2 minutes. But at least one short, one medium, and one long duration. And normally spanning of, let's say if you read some of the papers that are written on critical power modeling, and if you want it to, let's say, comply to most of the methods that are used to do power, or let's say power profiling, then you would try to stick between 2 to 15 minutes on this one. There are models where you can go outside of this, and in reality, you really don't need a model. You're just looking at the raw numbers. You're just looking at, as long as you're keeping the durations the same, or like fairly the same when you're going all out, then basically you will just look at which direction is the curve tilting. Have you grown the whole curve? Basically all your power outputs have become better. Fantastic. This is brilliant. You're really responding well to your training. If you have started to tilt or pivot your curve, then of course then you're more like coming more into the specialization, where you're starting to trade a little bit more, let's say, after high intensity training, more into, let's say, your longer duration training and so on.
And are they doing this within a couple of days? So they do the short duration one day and the long duration another day, or are they doing it across one session? So they say, listen, do a 1 minute, 5 minute, then a half hour, or how would you do it? Really
doesn't matter as long as you keep it fairly consistent. So for example, of course, you would maybe get a true say 20-minute all out. Let's say that if you do it like as a, of course you can always try to structure this in a smart way. Also you do in which order you do them. But let's say that for the sake of simplicity, you do it as a 1 minute, or let's say 2 minute all out, and then you do a 5 minute all out, and then you do a 10 minute all out, for example, or you do 5 or 10 and 20 minutes. Really doesn't matter. But either you would keep them apart with the same kind of training schedule over a couple of days. So let's say you do it over a week. So you do one Tuesday, one Thursday, one Saturday, for example. Or you could just do all of them on the same day, but let's say the preconditions and the way you execute it has to be the same for it to be as comparatively as possible, and probably even best done. If you do it sometimes outdoors and sometimes indoors, that's going to skew your results. Yeah. So that's also something to keep in mind. And then again, also if you do it, let's say in the winter season, indoor on a trainer, and then you are starting to spend less and less time on your turbo as summer starts to approach, and then you get back on the turbo and do it also, you might get deflated numbers too, because you don't have the same amount of hours spent of the turbo. So you're a little bit, let's say, call it out of turbo training. Yep. So I would, again, we are looking to make things perfect that might not be possible to make perfect. So you have to make the best out of it. But this profile is something I would look to do on a regular basis. And I would say that like early in the season, you will have much more response. So I would say that every four weeks is probably good. So you don't waste more time than necessarily on where you could have make adjustments. And
the reason you do that is to then change prescription going forward. So it's
yes.
not testing for testing's sake. It's testing so that our prescription improves.
Yes.
Based on how we've adapted. So
Yep.
I've seen a pivot of my curve that I don't want to see or I do want to see.
Yep.
And let's double down or let's change some stuff.
Yeah.
And also then I can prescribe intensity at a different rate because now my curve has changed as well. So
yes.
it is both about prescription but as well as feedback. So it's feed forward and feedback mechanisms for these people as well. So
Exactly.
really important to remember that. I would say you're effectively talking about two things, which is let's keep a situation sterile. Let's taper for 2 weeks and then go to a lab and do a V2 max test or whatever, or go do whatever testing protocol I want. Or let's never test and go in the field and just look at my field numbers and how do they change. And that's the spectrum we're deciding between. And you have to choose where you lie on that. You have to control as many variables as possible, but it's good. The more variables you control, the harder it becomes and the more maybe valid it is, but the less real world it might be. And the harder it is to start balancing that, particularly if you want to keep training through it. Because if you spend 1 in 4 weeks tapering for a test every 4 weeks, you spend half a month wasting time and not getting better. So we need to balance the two, I think, is the key thing here. And sometimes, maybe early in the season, you may actually go, listen, I'm going to use intuition because I know my body and I know what things have changed. And my hour long power has gone up a bit. So I'm going to change my prescription without necessarily doing another test, right? Just so that I can keep training through and don't have to taper down for the test because I'm getting such good indicators that these things have improved.
And I would say that I wouldn't even taper for this because this testing you can just do as a part of your training, like a normal training.
Yep.
Because as long as you keep the training leading into this the same every time you do it, the conditions are the same and you're just looking for improvement. You're not looking for bragging numbers where you're just looking to produce the absolute highest 5-minute power or 10-minute power, something like this. You're just looking exactly of how much have my 5-minute power changed since last time and how much have my 5-minute power versus my 10-minute versus my 20-minute power changed, or whatever power number that you are aiming for. You're just looking for the delta change in this, and that is what really matters. So the most important thing is to keep things consistent. And then also one other thing just to add to that, and that even if you live in a place where you don't have to be very much on a turbo, you can be outdoors training, temperature is going to change throughout the season as well.
Climate, humidity, climate,
yeah, exactly. And that's going to influence also your power output. If it's like super hot one day when you're going out, that's going to most likely impair your power output. So things will never be perfect, and that's a little bit the thing that we just have to live with. It's the same on race day. You can't predict race day. You can have some ideas about what you want to do on race day, but you just have to adapt on race day anyway. So I think take things as a training, take things as a learning, and then try to make things as systematic as possible. But there will always be uncertainties.
Of course. So now we have good testing. We're testing early on. We're testing more, right? So roughly monthly as we adapt quicker, and we've got 12 months. Does that? I assume that then pushes out a little bit. So maybe you're testing 6 weekly, and then maybe every 2 months as you get closer to race day. Do those testing frequencies? Does that change how you're programming or just what you're programming, if that makes sense? So yes, it changes the power numbers or the run paces, but does it change what you're doing within the season, or how are you blocking that sort of training for these guys or girls?
So now, of course, when we are back to Olympic racing, things are back a little bit more to...
Oh, no, we're still on our 10.5 hour Ironman athlete.
Oh yeah.
So.
Yeah, but for Christian and Gustav, of course, when we were switching more between, let's say, short course, long course, and especially when we went from short course to long course, then there were, of course, much bigger changes to the program. But when you stay on, let's say, one course, and this is what you're aiming for, then of course you can standardize things a little bit more. And that is actually also, there's a lot of value into that. Don't change something just to change something or to make things fancy or these kind of things, because that's not going to make you better. Most likely it's just going to make you worse. So for an athlete that, let's say that now you have a change in your profile, and exactly like you say, if you now have an improvement in the profile that actually looks like, or it is growing, let's say the whole profile is increasing and you're still far away from a competition, brilliant. Just continue to do what you do. because you're responding like very well all over the place. If you start to see that you are getting less response in one domain than other domains now, and you are still far away from a competition, then you have to look at the consequence of that, of whether that will be a comma limitation at some point of the season, and you have to start to do smaller changes to or let's say avoid that you get. And of course, this is now we are talking about things now that ends up causing a lot of questions, because things are still where we are specific but unspecific.
So historically, coaches have talked about staleness a lot, right? So if you read old texts, they'll say, the athlete got stale. Or how do we avoid staleness? Or, overtraining is probably a more modern version of that. But what you're talking about here is, okay, I'm going to, for some reason, the training I've done and my response to it, regardless of what it is, has brought up my 60-minute power. But yeah, now I'm actually flattening my curve too much, and I'm still 8 months away from an Ironman for whatever reason. Now I have to actually raise my 5-minute power again, or at least microdose some of that in there to try and even out that curve, or I will get flat, because otherwise I can't keep pushing that up, as you said. So that's what we're talking about. It doesn't have to be more complicated than that. It's just have a look at these curves. Are they moving in the right directions? What if you carry on the same trajectory of that improvement, and that's not what you're going to do, but let's assume it is, where are you going to end up based on the time course, right? Because now we have a time course, which is where did I start? Where am I going to? And then where am I in that journey? And let's extrapolate those out and try and make sure that I get there as I want to get there, right? So we don't need to be in Ironman shape 8 months out. That's not helpful. And you don't want a profile that looks like an Ironman 8 months out. You want a profile that looks like an Ironman probably 1 month out, and then do a bit of sharpening, taper, and go on race day.
Yeah. I think so. If you're okay, again, we talked in the first episode a little bit about Kipchoge, and I think we mentioned that he had a utilization of 94% on the on the breaking two. So that, of course, gives you an indicator, because we can also say that your VO2 max, when you talk about utilization, then we know that in this case, if he could run at 94% for the full race, or let's say at least, it would be interesting to see this data more in detail. I think these are extrapolated data, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just go by that. I think that if you measured his VO2 max at the end of the race and where he was staying, those ratios would probably not be the same. But fresh, tested, yes, that's what it looked like when they tested. Okay, this is the velocity you have to go at to break two, and this is your VO2 max. So then we say, okay, that is happening at 94% of your VO2 max. But nevertheless, if we just go simplify a little bit now, and then we say that, okay, that's the case, then we can say that, well, if your profile, and in this case, it was 94% for 2 hours. So you would say, okay, if your VO2 max then is, let's say, a certain number, and the amount of oxygen you're using at 2 hours versus your VO2 max is 94%, then we can surely just convert this now straight into power numbers instead. So we can basically say, hey, now VO2 max is something that's very equivalent to, let's say, 3 to 5 minute power. But let's say, for the sake of simplicity, we use 5 minute power. So if your 2 hour power sits in at 94% of your 5 minute power, you're
perfect. You're perfect for a marathon and not a lot else. So now if he wants to run that, let's say he wants to run sub 2 hours in Berlin, right? Yep. Or in then is his next attempt. Now he needs to improve that VO2 max.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, he has to get to 95%, 96%. And one of those things is more likely to change than the other one.
Exactly.
And to be in an other world, I mean, he's otherworldly anyway, but to get even closer to unheard of numbers, if he wants to get to 95 or 96, that's a little bit harder than increasing his VO2 max.
Yeah, and that's the same thing here as well. So you already now have an indicator. So let's say that you are doing a profiling now, and you look at your 5 minute power versus your 60 minute power. Obviously, 60 minute power should be... then in this case, like for example, for Kipchoge, if we used him, if we said that the 2 hour power, so 120 minute power was then at 94% of his 5 minute power, then basically his 60 minute power will obviously be at even higher fraction of utilization of VO2 max, or let's say a 5 minute power than his 120 minute power. So the thing is here that, of course, here you already have a number. You can use at least 94%, and for your sake, you can look at then 95 or 96%. And if you are there, then I would say that you are 8 months out. You really have to work on your 5 minute power, like you say. That's most likely going to be the most effective way to do something about this. You don't want to lose the power output at your 60 minute power, but you can actually reduce the volume of training you're doing at that quite significantly. You can probably reduce it 30%, depending, of course, on how many hours you're putting in of training. I didn't ask you that in the initially when you said that you're going to improve your marathon by, because that's like we talk about, you have the performance medal, you're making the gap, and of course we need to know your budget. So how many hours are you training? Yeah. So we haven't talked about that yet, so we have to come into that. But how many hours are you training?
Yeah, well, we'll get to that. But you've made a really good point, which is you can reduce volume significantly on the stuff where you're already close to max, particularly 8 months out. Right now, we can really work towards, okay, let's cut that volume, let's spend some more of our budget, whatever that is, time, energy, emotional energy, all of it, right? Resources on that. So no, I think that's a really good, I think that's helpful. I mean, we can't give everybody's perfect example, but I think that's really, really helpful there. So you would then be working on, so traditional periodization models work on a macro cycle, often a year, sometimes quadrennial cycle, so an Olympic cycle, which is not really relevant to most age group athletes, but let's talk about the macro cycles, often a year, so it's Kona to Kona effectively for these people, a lot of people, or maybe they have to qualify for Kona again if they didn't go fast enough in Kona. So now you've got Kona to Kona, you have to have at least one race in there. So you're going to break it up into probably 2 smaller cycles, and then you usually have a meso cycle of roughly a month. But these, it sounds like, are going to change for these people, right? So these meso cycles will be different. And then we have our micro cycle, which is for most people a week. We're going to double click on that in a little while. We'll get back to the week thing. This is something we mentioned earlier, and I'm excited about it. But how would you build those blocks? So the blocks obviously usually will, for you, are non-linear, right? They're not necessarily like 1 month. And they're not necessarily traditional in that they focus on a specific thing as much as they are as a result of the testing. Is that fair to say? So they would say... Yeah,
this is of course where things is more complex, because there is a lot of, let's say, thoughts or evaluations that goes into this, because this is also something that you have to look at in, let's say, in light of the performance model, and how long time does it take to change what you have identified as the most important of, let's say, when you make a priority list and you look at the gaps, where are the most to be gained, and how long time does it take to change it? It might be that those things where there are most to be gained are like quick fixes. Well, then you can wait about it. You have to focus on those things that are there where you can get most gains, but it also takes longer time to do something about. So there's a combination about how much time does it take and what's the reward of doing it. And then when you look at this, then you start to you get a priority list of the things that you want to look or what you want to change. And this will drive the length of the mesocycles, or how many mesocycles you're going to repeat. Now we are just excluding the account that you're not going to do a lot of competitions. So that makes it, of course, much easier. If you want to do competitions, then of course that can be a part of the strategy as well. But again, to not complicate it too much, then I would say that depending on what we need to work on, that basically dictates the length of the mesocycle.
And do you have a rough ballpark figures on timelines on these things, or is that too hard to say for most people?
So for example, let's say that we want to increase let's go purely by your power profile now. So we know that, for example, like increasing your 5-minute power is something we can do, and that will be the equivalent of your VO2 max. So the long haul belief of that VO2 max is genetic and it cannot be very much changed is as false as it can be, I would say. We can easily change VO2 max for a person by 50%. And then the same thing also goes with 5-minute power, because obviously if you can increase your 5-minute power, if you start out with you haven't been training and you're starting out, or you're training very little and you start out at, let's say, 200 watts, it's not a problem for people to bring this up to 250, 300 watts, and then you already have more than 50% increase. So with volume, of course, you're not going to get it for free. You have to work for it, obviously. Nature is smart.
And just to be clear as well, when you say 50%, you mean from lowest to highest value? You're not necessarily meaning you can double Christian or Gustav's at any point? There
we are probably closer to a maximum now, at least for the time that we spend on the training.
And the other thing is that's with a trade-off, right? So you've gone from, for instance, going from Ironman back down to Olympic distances. We're going to sacrifice a lot of our 2-hour power, 4-hour power, 6-hour power with the view towards increasing 5-minute power. And that's how you've balanced that scale. And conversely, going back, you'll do the opposite. Today's episode is provided by VO2 Master, your solution in making informed training decisions and unlocking advanced insights into human performance.
Upgrade your training in metabolic assessments with the user-friendly VO2 Master Analyzer. VO2 Max RMR CPET with the reliability, accuracy, and portability that you want. Use the code Olav Method, that's OLAVMETHOD, during checkout at vo2master.com to get a free assessment kit with the purchase of your first VO2 Master Analyzer. So now we've got an idea of duration. So you said we can quite quickly turn over 5-minute power or VO2 max. We can quite quickly improve that. What's the timeline to improve something like 60-minute or 2-hour power?
I think that 5-minute power, the reason why that's very effective to increase is that, again, you're looking to improve something that lasts for 5 minutes. So to grossly oversimplify it, basically the time it takes to improve or to work on your 5-minute power is much shorter than it is for your 60-minute power. Of course, nobody would limit themselves just to do like 1 5-minute all out and that's it. You would, of course, break it down into micro intervals and everything. So you would use, of course, the whole session. But very often it is quite quick to improve your let's say shorter duration power than it is to increase your longer duration power, just because of the sheer amount of hours or time that is needed in order to repeat that kind of effort. Of course, that again, you won't do that. Go out and do like 60-minute power today. You do it in 2 days time again, and another 2 days time, or let's say 3 times a week or whatever. You're gonna break that also into intervals, and maybe you're not gonna do a 60-minute all out either. You are just looking at maybe like when you do, let's say, intervals, longer duration intervals, and you accumulate, let's say, a lot of work around your 60-minute power inside a session. Then of course that's maybe a little bit more, but increasing the longer duration power, it just requires more time, or like just in a single session it takes more time. You can't it will be much harder. You like increasing your 5-minute power will also actually in most situations also influence not only your 5-minute power, it's going to influence your 10, 20, 30, 60-minute power, everything.
Yeah.
It's not like there is one thing without the other thing. But at some point when you're getting more closer to, let's say, that peak performance for yourself, this is when you have to start to pivot the curve, and basically increasing your 5-minute power unfortunately will start to compromise your 60-minute power, because you have to choose where to spend more time to grow it further up. So this is why I normally divide between growing the curve and pivoting the curve. Like growing the curve is basically where everything just grows up and everything gets more powerful, like your short, medium, and longer duration power. And then you get closer to race where you start to pivot this curve towards exactly what is the target for the race that you're doing. So 5-minute power obviously is very quick but it's fast to do something with. I would even say that everything down to depend. But if you now are looking to improve your time from 11 hours to 10:30, you are an athlete that are spending quite a lot of time on training, I guess. So how many hours are you spending on training?
Let's call it 20 hours a week.
20 hours a week. Okay, that's brilliant. Then you're really invested in this. So if you spend 20 hours on training, and that is a sustainable situation for you, so you have a good balance in life with that. So we are not looking to reduce those hours actually, because if you're like running around all the time, you don't get enough recovery in these kind of things, it might not be the best result to train 20 hours.
We're getting there.
We'll
get there. That's a couple episodes time.
So then if we now again then say that, okay, yes, this is a sustainable situation, then with 20 hours a week, then you got plenty of time to train.
Yeah.
That means that you got a big budget to invest into different kinds of training, and then I would say that most of you are having probably several sessions that are also quite longer in duration as well, maybe upwards to 4 hours, for example, and then 8 months from the race, and if now let's say that your 20-minute power is 90% of your 5-minute power, then I would say that we need to take a little bit of that time that you're now spending on the longer duration workouts you do.
Pivot it to the short stuff.
Yeah, and to the shorter stuff. And I would maybe even advise on bringing down the volume slightly too. And the simple reason for that is because not much, because the benefit of having a big volume is, of course, that at the moment we then also have more room to trade away some volume for more recovery as well. And if we can recover more for that, let's say the 5-minute session, then or not 5-minute session, but the session where we are trying to increase our 5-minute power, shorter duration power. We very often say 5-minute power now. Just don't mistake that, because it can be like, it could be like 1 or 2 or 7 but anyway, the point is that you have like 3 different durations of power, and then we are just using 5 minutes just to keep it simple.
So you've got a ton of budget to spend.
Yeah.
You can spend extra resources recovering.
Yeah.
Because the training impulse from the sessions for 5 minutes is quite high.
Yeah.
And not necessarily very long, but it is a very high impulse, a very significant impulse. So that is going to take more recovery than, say, an hour-long easier ride, right? So
absolutely. Yeah.
You might decide that, hey, instead of spending, we might make the session 40 minutes and spend the extra 20 minutes instead of riding easy somewhere else on recovery, and just spend it that way and keep it really simple. It's just that's maybe where we'll trade some of that off.
Yeah, and of course I would probably not advise on trying to increase your 5-minute power by going 5 minutes all out and then trying to recover from that and then do another 5 minute all out and try to recover from it, because that's not going to probably be very productive. I would probably try to stay away from going to exhaustion, actually, for most of the training sessions that you do.
I think that's a really important point.
Yeah.
The number of times I think that some people are wiping themselves off the ground, absolute messes, is just, it's unsustainable in the context of a professional, let alone somebody who's got a job or something else on the side. Is just keeping that, making sure you can go the next day.
Exactly. The reward for doing that is very small. Of course, it's important to, of course, train your pain tolerance and an ability to really like dig a hole through the ground and then try to dig a hole through the hole. But that, I think, is something that you have to be very sparingly on. And I would even there consult with somebody. But it's general to hear that, for example, like if you talk with Christian, Gustav, Jakob Ingebrigtsen, and many other athletes, you'll very often hear that they actually say that the times that they actually go to exhaustion, or where they are trying to like bring out their A game in training, is actually very seldom or never, especially if you're doing a little bit more of races, because basically that's not where you're looking to perform. And basically time to recover also from a session like that is unproportionately longer than it is to just keep it a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter. But the benefit you get, not like, yes, surely you can get a little bit of more benefit in that single session, but the problem is that you're not going to do a single session. You're going to do 20 hours of training, and you're looking to keep that sustainable. That means basically trying to perform better and better and better for every session you go, more or less. Of course, they're going to be sometimes a little bit worse, sometimes better, but in general, the trend should be positive. And that means that you have to basically be very careful with the intensity.
Because the cost of messing it up is injury, and one of the best predictors of performance is injury-free time. And being able to stack week on week, month on month, year on year. It's not about one session. It's about how that one session fits into a week, which fits into a month, which fits into a year. Yeah. So that at the end of the year, you're better by a significant amount. So it's, that extra 5% of really burying yourself probably isn't worth it. I mean, it definitely isn't worth it.
Yeah. And I think also for age groupers, you might not be injured, but you will maybe stagnate. So you don't get the development that you probably could have. And that's why it's also important when you are looking at your periodizations, when you're looking at the mesocycle periodization. Of course, there you are also going to have I would like to clarify one thing very early on, and that is there is no such thing as high quality and low quality, or there shouldn't be, because everything should be quality.
We've got quality coming up in our training podcast, so we won't touch too much on that.
Yeah,
but
so we are not talking here about everything you do should be high quality, and that means that basically if your key sessions are being influenced by a lower, or let's say what's supposedly going to be a low intensity session, then that is not good quality in your planning or in your training. The way that it should be set up is that you need to make priorities in your training. So in the mesocycles, you're going to have microcycles, and in the microcycles, there you're looking at like your workouts. And the workouts should be there in order to exactly try to influence your profile in the direction that you're looking to influence it. So for example, if you're looking now to increase your short duration power, you have already said that, okay, yeah, I'm going to have a little bit more like high intensity sessions here now. And then when you're going to have a little bit more of this high intensity session, that means basically not you're going to skip all the other sessions you have, because you're still looking to maintain that longer duration power that you have developed. You don't want to lose that. So you're not going to make like a huge shift towards high intensity training. It just means that you're trying to be a little bit smart about it and maybe dosing in a little bit more of it, again, step by step. So then like one way, for example, like trying to increase your 5-minute power is, I think there are two parts that are super important to it. One is, of course, like purely like the physiological part of it. You need to put out power that is in the domain of your 5-minute power, or maybe slightly higher because you bring it down to shorter intervals. The other part of it is that you also have to be motivated to do that, because it doesn't matter if you have the most like, we have done so much research on this kind of micro interval Tabata training or whatever that you have there, and you're not motivated to do it, then just forget it. You're not going to excel probably very well on it. You have to develop, start with a good micro interval session. That is a good thing. Like good basis, a good practice is always start with something that is well documented that is working. So Tabata intervals is works well. Then really the way to quantify this is to look at, okay, if you're using a power meter as a tool to control the intensity, then you're actually just looking at, okay, let's say my 5-minute power is 400 watts. Basically what you're looking at doing now is that, okay, you already say now I can do 400 watts for 5 minutes before I'm basically completely exhausted if I go in one go. Okay, simplified now. What we are trying to do now in this single session here now is to accumulate as much time as possible at 400 watts. Not with the highest possible heart rate or all this kind of thing, because that's not going to bring you faster to the finish line. It's basically more power that's going to bring you more power for longer duration. That's what's going to bring you to the finish line faster, most likely. So I would say rather than, okay, go out with something that is really good. Like, so for example, like Renestas training is 2 blocks of 13 intervals on off, where the 30 seconds is basically around 120% of FTP, and there's 15 seconds at 60% of FTP, and then you repeat this for 30 seconds for 13 times, and then you have a set break between there of, let's say, a couple of minutes, 3 minutes, and then you repeat this for another block. Now you have accumulated effectively over 20 minutes of work at your, let's say, above your VO2 max. So the thing is here that that when you then do that, then how motivated were you actually for this session? Was it like, did you really enjoy it? Brilliant. Then
go again.
Yeah. And just like take the learnings that you got from this session and try to improve on it. Like try to relax a little bit more while you're still putting out the same power number. Try to breathe more effectively. Things that you basically know are good for basically sustainability or the ability to excel on these kind of intervals. And then you're looking to basically improve on that. If you're not motivated, okay, what did you not like? Was it basically too many micro intervals? Is it easier for you to maybe bring down the power a little bit and then rather do longer intervals with a slightly longer break or something like this? To basically, again, you're looking to basically, in this case, the benchmark here in this session is basically now, in this case, 400 watts for a little bit more than 20 minutes. So let's say it's 22 minutes. Yep. You're basically, how you achieve those 22 minutes at 400 watts is your basis. This is if you have a 60-minute session with a warm-up and a cool-down, basically how can you structure those 400 watt intervals now in a way? Is it 3 minutes on, 1.5, 2 minutes off, 3 minutes on again? Doesn't really matter, as the way you basically find something that really motivates you to put out that power, because it's not your heart rate, it's not your VO2 that's going to make you fast on race day. In this case, when you're sitting on the turbo, it purely is the power that you're putting out, and of course eventually the ability to sustain that power also in an aerodynamic position as well.
Yeah, and I mean, the difference between a 30-15 or a 20-10, I don't think anybody thinks it's significant. I think they're talking about rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, if anything. The difference is almost negligible. As you said, the goal is as much accumulating time above 400 or at 400, break that up how you want to break it up. And if you find that variety is something you enjoy, break it up and make it more variety week to week. And if you don't want variety and you want the same thing to benchmark yourself, then keep it the same.
Exactly. And you can even inside a session start out with longer duration intervals, and then you make it shorter and shorter and shorter.
Ramp it up and down, do whatever you want.
Yeah. And then the goal, exactly like you say, you want to, let's say, make a progression on that one for next week. If you are able to accumulate 20 minutes this week, go for 21 minutes next week.
Yep. Exactly. Right. The point of the day I've been most excited about, microcycles. So How would you think about a microcycle? I mean, the most simple microcycle and the one that's used universally is 7 days, because the work week is 7 days. So aside from work, which is going to be the biggest constraint, and the easiest answer is always going to be just keep it 7 days, or perhaps push it to 14. So you have the smallest repeating cycle, which is the definition of microcycle, might be 2 weeks, right? For some people, because they want to run, I know Kipchoge uses a sort of longer run every second week, and then 1 week does interval, more intensity in that long run. So it could be 2 weeks. Well, let's say it's not a multiple of 7. Why would you change it, and what factors go into that?
So again, that would actually be, for me, a function of budget. So it will look at how can I expand my budget, because we just talked about intervals.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what we are trying to do is that we are just looking at it now on a macro scale, an interval on a macro scale, because you have hard days, easy days, and then maybe you have a little bit like 2 days that are maybe a little bit easier, and then you go hard days. So you can almost look at this as basically an interval, a break, an interval, a break, a set break, an interval and a set break. So basically, this is again basically where we're just looking at how can we not accumulate now the most work per time inside a session. We're looking at how can we now accumulate the most work per week.
Or per smallest repeating cycle, right? So 10 days, 7 days, whatever it is.
Well, actually, I wouldn't say 7 days. I would actually look at it even on a longer scale. So basically, you're just looking at how can you, on a macro scale, look at how can you actually get the most work done.
So in a year then. So how do I achieve the most in a year, not how do I achieve the most in a week or in a day or in a session?
Yeah, exactly. And then basically from there, of course, limitation actually for Christian and Gustav is that actually there we have to be cautious, because we are at the limit of how much energy they are able to get in. So how much food actually comes into their body. But the thing is that how I would look at my cycles is depending a little bit on what I do. The funny thing is that actually for Olympic racing, I would be able to have a longer cycle before I repeat it. For Ironman, the problem there is that there you're going to have typically, at least closer to a race, you're going to have like longer sessions where you really you are starting to work more on your race power. And the problem with those sessions actually is that you are actually also taking out quite a lot of calories.
Yeah.
So for example, if you go for a 4-hour ride and you are putting out, let's say 270 watts, that means basically now you are doing effectively around 1,000 kilojoules an hour. And if you
can't put that back in. There's no way you can put in close to race pace at race pace.
Yeah, that's 4,000 kilojoules. And if you have now, let's say you have a biochemical efficiency of, let's say 20%, that means basically that the amount of calories that you are actually now burning at the same time is more in the range of 1,300 kilocalories per hour. And we also know that basically if you take in one calorie of carbs, you're not going to store that because of processes that happens in the body. In order to be able to utilize that, you are maybe left with 70% of that calorie that you actually take in. So 0.7% of that. So it means that basically the ratio between what you put in and what you get out also of food is also highly dependent on what kind of food you are eating. Fats, of course, is a very good ratio. Carbs is a much worse ratio. But the point is exactly that when you do more like Ironman specific training, the problem is that you are running into a domain where you can easily end up stagnating, because you are able to do so much work on a day that it almost becomes like difficult to eat enough to sustain that. And if you do that then for many days in a row, then you are going to go into deficit, and then it's just a matter of time whether before you start to stagnate or where you go stale, as you say, or you basically get overtrained. And of course, in some senses, hopefully you're just getting a warning that, oh, I'm so tired today, I'm not able to do my training, and you end up skipping your training and you're getting back to it. Yeah, exactly, because you now are like getting forced to take a break. You're able to get, and you are eating naturally, and you're able to recover and get back into energy balance. But this is of course the difficult part of it, because people are not used to think of these kind of things in terms of budget. Because if you just think in terms of volume, you can have a high volume, but you do very little work, for example. And if you do very little work, then of course the calorie demand for this is then also equally smaller. And if the calorie demand is equally smaller, then basically you will be able to sustain that easily also by normal like eating and a little bit more eating. But Ironman training, then typically you probably have to repeat rest days more often to bring you back into balance. You maybe do a couple of days, and then basically you need to bridge in, for example, more like a recovery day, just to be able to bring you back into balance. You're actually effectively putting in a credit for a couple of days, and then you pay that back on the recovery day. When you do more high intensity stuff or medium to high intensity stuff, then it limits a little bit basically time to exhaustion, limits the whole thing. Of course, even if you don't go to exhaustion, then it's even less time. So that means that basically the amount of work that you're able to put in is effectively much less than when you do like the Ironman training.
The problem with Ironman is the intensity is such that it can be sustained for so long that you have this perfect mix of intensity and duration such that you just end up absolutely burning all of the resources versus, as you say, high intensity stuff, which is limited by other factors, right? So there's almost no limit to Ironman intensity theoretically, aside from the ability to put calories back in, which is basically the model you work off.
And actually, that's also one of the things, like I'm a big fan of physics, and there, of course, you have the laws of thermodynamics, which I really like, because it makes it easier sometimes to black box stuff and just understand whether something really makes a difference to performance or not. But you have also, when you talk about intensity, we also have the power law. So grossly simplified, it means basically if you increase your intensity for 2.5%, okay, are you able to feel a difference of 2.5%? So let's say 2.5% basically means that 200 watts, that's not much a change of power. If you have a 10% increase, that means basically 220 watts. If it's a 5%, then it's 210 watts. Do you feel the difference even between 200 and 210 watts? Maybe, most likely not. 2.5%, that basically means that if you actually go at the difference between 200 watts and 205 watts, something that you won't most likely be able to feel very much of a difference of. If you basically look now at your power profile and you move the cursor, so let's say if you have a Strava account, for example. So in Strava now, you move your cursor over the power profile that you have there, and you actually now you just say, okay, so let's say you look at 200 watts, or let's say you go higher, depending on where let's say where you think your FTP sits, for example. But let's say you go around your FTP, and now let's say your FTP is 200 watts. For sake of simplicity, let's now find that power that sits 5 watts higher, so 2.5% higher. Typically, you see that the time to exhaustion on 2.5% higher is going to be almost 50% shorter. If you go 2.5% higher than that again, then you see another reduction of 50%. If you go 2.5% higher, then you get another 50% in reduction of that, grossly speaking. Yep. But the point is that intensity has a second power impact on basically time to exhaustion, and then also, of course, like your training load compared to duration. Yeah. So that's why, for example, the higher intensity you go, it will naturally limit itself.
It also explains why it's harder to recover from.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So,
yeah.
No,
so
that's great. I think we've really nailed planning here. So work back from the start. So what's the goal? How do we get there? Where are my deficits? And how do I address them? And then start out profiling. Profile yourself regularly. Work out what's your rate of adaptation and what are those adaptations? And are they the right trajectory, or are they going to hit too early or too late? And how do you tweak it? How do you change the balance of higher intensity, lower intensity work within that block? And those blocks need to be as frequent as required based on your confidence in the training you're doing to make the effective changes you think are happening. And based on your, how confident you are from the training metrics you're seeing. You may be able to see that in training that you feel you don't need to test again, but remembering that the testing is about both feedback and feed forward as to how you prescribe or how you're being prescribed to your intensities specifically. And then microcycles are related to the work in them. Think about how that budget. So for most people, they'll be time limited or emotional energy limited, or those things where, Sunday's a day where they can go long and they can't go long more than that. So that makes a ton of sense, Olav. That's been really good. That was a lot longer than I thought it would be on planning, but very valuable. And that's not a bad thing. I think planning is probably the thing that age groupers do the least, and the thing where they could have the most benefit is actually doing more than just, this week I have training. It's like, well, where does this training fit within this month or this year or this goal period right? And it might be that most people are probably going to have 2 cycles a year. Let's be honest, they're going to have to qualify for Kona, then race Kona as well. Most people would race 2 races a year minimum, and many more. So,
and I think also the further away you are from a race as well, the more important it is also to think of when you are on that session itself. Because now we just said, okay, there are some, let's say you set a power target in a session and you're trying to achieve that. You might some days be able to achieve it easily, other days is barely, and other days you won't be able to achieve it. And that's, of course, the natural variation that is in the body, and this is, of course, important to be aware of. So what I would always say that is important here, because we haven't talked about the balance inside a microcycle between the different sessions, but I think it is very important to always be thinking ahead. So when you are in that specific session, how is this influencing my next session? Am I able to actually progress on my next important session, my next key session? Or actually am I digging myself through the floor here and I'm going to be completely like exhausted? And if you're unsure, better hold back a little bit today, because you have so many more sessions to come on where you can learn from than basically digging a hole through the floor today. And then basically you are not capable of doing your next, that you're not learning as effectively as if you're holding back a little bit when you are uncertain.
You're better off holding a lot back.
I would more like say inside a session that dial back the intensity rather a little bit more than trying just to stick to a target, because the difference between lowering your, let's say, your power output by 1 or 2% or something like this is so much better for motivation, the psychological part of it, and also let's say purely let's say the long-term physiological benefits than trying just to like, oh, I think I'm super strong, and then you overestimate your capabilities and you blow up internally in the session. The total amount of work now you have done in that session, if you blow up after your first set, that's already a 50% reduction. And that's not very good advancement then to go bring into the next session. So this is like intensity is very fragile or much more sensitive, and you need to always think a little bit ahead in the session. The intensity I'm going out, am I able to do like this set here and I will be able to do the next set, or do I have to dial back a little bit? That's one. And the second part of it is going to be when you are inside the set, I'm digging my completely self through the floor here, and then I would probably need like the Saturday session. If it's Thursday today and the Saturday session, I'm not sure if I'm motivated even to do that. Then dial back and make this session more like good, so that you're ready also for that Saturday session. Consistency is over time is key.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that's a great note to end on. So thanks again for listening into this episode of the Norwegian Method Podcast. And that's episode 2, all done and dusted, everything planning. So hopefully you enjoyed that one. Please send us through any questions that you do have, as we've said before, via DM on Instagram to the SantaraTech Instagram account, via email to info@santaragroup.com, or if you're listening on Spotify, put it in the Q&A section down there, and we will get to it in our final episode of the season. Again, if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Rate the podcast as well and share it with a friend. Now, of course, we will see you back here next week, where we'll be touching on everything racing. So, see you then.